How's everybody doing? Good, good, good. Okay, we're going to proceed to our second panel on the School of Arts and Sciences, and I'm just going to briefly mention who the speakers are. First, Sanchita Balachandran, who is speaking about archaeology. Next, Dr. Nathan Connolly, who's already been introduced, speaking about history. And third, Dr. Quinn Slobodian from Wellesley, who will be speaking about sociology. And then we'll have comments from Tali Ziv, who is the another postdoctoral fellow in the program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship. So I will turn it over.
All right, thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to discuss how new meaning was put into ancient records, excavating the history of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, 1882 to 1930. Okay, and I think we're gonna have a slight light change, so hopefully we can see the slides a bit more. All right, okay. So I want to first acknowledge the contributors to this project, including Hopkins faculty, staff, postdoctoral fellows, graduate students, undergraduates, and external researchers. And I'm indebted to the many specialists in Egyptology, Near Eastern Studies, and classics who have generously offered me disciplinary context for the work I share here today. In his 1884 volume, Methods of Historical Study, Johns Hopkins history professor Herbert Baxter Adams wrote, quote, "Works of history are likely to become dead specimens of humanity unless they continue in some way to quicken the living age. But written history seldom fails to accomplish this end, and even antiquated works often continue their influence if viewed as progressive phases of human knowledge. Monuments and inscriptions can never grow old as long as the race is young. New meaning is put into ancient records, fresh garlands are hung upon broken statues, new temples are built from classic materials, and the world rejoices at its constant self-renewal." Written during the earliest years of the Johns Hopkins University, this book lays out the stakes of history and the ways that history might be best taught. One strategy for bringing the past, and in particular the ancient past, alive again was to literally put objects from antiquity into students' hands, to make ancient people's things tangible and ever-present as sources of evidence, research, and inspiration. As director of the university's Archaeological Museum, this is a 141-year tradition that I carry on, putting ancient objects into the hands of thousands of students each year as a way of quickening the living age. But this legacy has a complicated and troubling history, one I've been exploring through the project Excavating the History of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum. My main interest is in how museum objects are mobilized, and especially how they work to produce effects through their visual and tactile forms. Beginning in 1882, just 6 years after the founding of Johns Hopkins, ancient objects and modern replicas of ancient objects begin to infiltrate the university. Purchased or even created by Hopkins faculty, who were among the most important early scholars producing knowledge about the ancient past, these physical items did two different types of work. First, ancient items are used by faculty as a way to racialize ancient people, assigning them to categories such as white, black, or Aryan in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the ancient people themselves. In turn, this kind of racialization made it possible to create a narrative of, quote, progressive phases of human knowledge that made white American and European men, such as those in charge of the university and beyond, rightful inheritors of a noble white ancient past. Second, while Hopkins faculty were certainly not alone in assigning racial categories to ancient people, their academic credentials and networks, and particularly their roles as teachers of generations of scholars, amplified their reach. I'm interested in the scholarly habits, daily practices of student training, and public scholarship that were used to consolidate claims to rightful and racialized power that came directly from the ancient world. So new temples built from classic materials. The seminar room. Hopkins' earliest buildings, including McCoy Hall, were physically located in an environment experiencing tremendous economic and racial tensions amidst the growth and shift in Black and immigrant, particularly Jewish populations in Baltimore. But inside McCoy Hall, the ancient past was seamlessly intertwined with the present. And I'll just ask you to notice these lunette windows. These are the, let's see if this thing works. They are these sort of rounded shaped windows on the third floor of McCoy Hall. The Historical Museum, as the Archaeological Museum was once known, was on this third floor of McCoy Hall in the History and Political Science Seminary. And you can see just part of it framed against those same lunette windows. This is also where Herbert Baxter Adams taught in the seminar room, and his book reproduces a plan of its layout, as you see on the right. A closer view of the Historical Museum shows us ancient Egyptian objects neatly displayed in cases and also spilling out into the room. And I wonder if the museum was sited at this end of the room because it represented a time without texts, though the ancient Egyptians would have very much disagreed with that. Progressing forward in time and presumably in human knowledge, we reach the alcove laden with books on ancient history, and walking further forward might have perused books in general history. I'm thrilled to recognize some of the items on display in 1887 as ones still in our museum collection and part of our teaching practice today. And I want to acknowledge here the work of Museum Registrar Kate Gallagher, an Egyptologist, and Hopkins Near Eastern Studies graduate Meg Swaney for their extraordinary work on this collection. This display shows the Cohen Collection of Egyptian Antiquities, a group of nearly 700 objects donated to the university in 1884 by the family of prominent Jewish Baltimorean Mendes Israel Cohen. The Cohen Collection was already well known in Baltimore for its use in an illustrated lecture series on ancient Egypt in 1845. The Baltimore Sun records the lecturer, George Glidden, U.S. Vice Consul to Egypt, as stating that, quote, "The pyramids were not the work of slaves under cruel tyranny, but of free men under kind and considerate rulers. The Egyptians were white men, Caucasians and free," unquote. Scholarly debates about the race of the ancient Egyptians took on scientific dimensions, with Glidden and others proving their whiteness through the examination of ancient skulls. The prominent location and space ceded to these ancient Egyptian items in the seminar room suggests that they were thought worthy of being there. By contrast, Adams belittles the university's collection of ancient artifacts associated with the native peoples of Maryland, seeing them as having little historical value and unworthy of public display. To the left of the Historical Museum, both European and ancient Roman law books sat on the same shelf. The bust in Roman guise on top of it is not an ancient personage, but most likely John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, known for his role in establishing that court's prominence in interpreting the U.S. Constitution. And in front of European and Roman law, and above the alcove of state laws and state history, is a Roman representation of American Senator John C. Calhoun, known for his staunch defense of states' rights and slavery. And it's impossible to ignore the large wall map tracking the Aryan migration, which hangs over the Hopkins men bent over their books at their tables. Moving up the room in space and time, we encounter contemporary volumes and documents with the seminar table reserved for new books and current literature. And at the apex of time and place, at the literal head of the seminar table, sat Adams himself, framed by the works and portraits of his peers, holding forth among other faculty, graduate students, and even the office boy peeking through the doorway. What I'd like to point out here is how deliberate the staging of the seminar room is, with its commingled ancient and contemporary accoutrements, creating an environment where history is made sense of, where human progress was clear and even inevitable, and where the ultimate seat of power was occupied by a Hopkins specialist who had, quote, built a new temple from classic materials. New meaning put into ancient records, scholarly practices. So if physical environments made it possible to believe in particular claims to knowledge and power, how was that knowledge and power transferred? Here we have to look at teaching practices and how they mapped such beliefs onto the literal bodies of Johns Hopkins graduate students. By the summer of 1901, Adams had died, and so does not appear in this photograph of Hopkins faculty. I'll point out Paul Haupt, professor of Semitic languages, Basil Gildersleeve, professor of Greek, and William H. Welch, professor of medicine, who are among the earliest faculty hired by university president Daniel Coit Gilman, seated in the center.
How do you tell them apart?
They're all labeled. They're all labeled. That helped. Helped a lot. And some do have very distinctive facial hair. They're very proud of it. So recent scholarship has put necessary asterisks behind these prominent scholars' names. Haupt's promulgation of the idea of the Aryan ancestry of Jesus and his anti-Semitic views raised questions about what he brought with him into the seminar room. Basil Gildersleeve, whose name has graced the cover of the classics publication, the American Journal of Philology, since 1880, when he founded it here at Johns Hopkins, has had it struck from that publication in 2019 because of how he advocated racism and abused his academic credentials to do so. Welch has come under scrutiny for his embrace of eugenics in the realm of public health, and Gilman has been criticized, among other things that we've heard about this morning, for the ways that he balked at advocating for racial justice in access to education. But how did ancient items bring this group of people together? These are not ancient objects, but rather replicas of documents produced in ancient Mesopotamia in current-day Iraq. They are hand-sized cuneiform tablets inscribed by Paul Haupt as congratulatory messages for Gilman, Gildersleeve, and Welch. And here I want to acknowledge the expertise of Assyriologist Michael Chapin, graduate of the Johns Hopkins' Near Eastern Studies Department and now postdoctoral fellow at the Archaeological Museum, for his work on this collection. Written in either Neo-Assyrian or Neo-Babylonian scripts of the ancient Akkadian language, these texts recall the form of documents dated between 800 and 600 BCE that address royalty and scholars, and Haupt's tablets echo these ancient objects to equate Hopkins faculty with kings and even gods. The earliest text, written in 1899, congratulates Gilman on his 25th anniversary as president of Hopkins and hails him as, quote, the Lord of inscrutable wisdom, unquote, who has been entrusted with, quote, teaching humanity the truth, unquote. A tablet written in 1901 for Gildersleeve's 70th birthday asks both ancient Greek gods and scholars to praise and protect him, going as far as to compare Gildersleeve to Nestor, the king of Pylos, who appears in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Both Gilman and Gildersleeve tablets were exhibited on the same third floor of McCoy Hall and reproduced in print in the Johns Hopkins University Circular. The tablet written for Welch on his 70th birthday describes him as, quote, a great monument of the monumental city, the founder of the new temple of health, unquote. Its message traveled far beyond McCoy Hall, appearing in a 1920 volume of the Journal of the American Medical Association, which we've already heard a little bit about today. We might first see these tablets as quirky expressions of the level of admiration prevalent in Hopkins's close-knit scholarly community. But the elevation of these men to kingly or even divine status is almost sinister, as it emphasizes their infallibility and perhaps even warns against crossing men of such power. That unease grows stronger when we realize that the tablets existed in multiples and in multiple physical formats, reproduced not only by Haupt, but also the graduate students that he taught. Haupt made multiple clay versions of the Gilman and Gildersleeve tablets, and he also wrote them on paper, and he set them as exercises for his graduate students to copy, transliterate, and translate. And here you see 2 student papers based on Haupt's Gilman tablet. Through this practice, graduate students were inculcated into the bodily practices required for disciplinary expertise, but were also disciplined into paying obeisance to the powerful members of the university who ruled over their scholarly lives. One of Haupt's students, distinguished biblical scholar William F. Albright, who returned to teach at Hopkins, noted the double-edged value of such rigorous training as both necessary and so overbearing that Haupt students nicknamed him Lord Yahweh, or God. Looking at this image of the Archaeological Museum as it was in 1915 on the top floor of McCoy Hall, I'm struck by all of the objects I recognize and that we still display and teach with in our current museum in Gilman Hall, and that come freighted with both ancient and more recent histories. At its core, this project makes me think more critically about how particular versions of the ancient and recent past were created and transmitted, and how we might tell more honest stories about them. It also makes clear the responsibility of the university, its leadership and faculty in the ethical discovery and use of knowledge, both to the students we train and send forth to train others, and in the ways that we share this knowledge with the world. Thank you.
So I have a warm spot in my heart for sharing the stage with Sanchita because we've had a number of very impassioned and damn near conspiratorial conversations about how we can read texts like Adams. She was the first one to tell me to really examine like the physical space of the seminar room and the cataloging structure and the assumption of order that Adams and company attempted to impose on this world through like the filing system. And she pointed out the John C. Calhoun bus, which still continues to blow my mind that people do that. I want to also just kind of speak a little bit around this question of my own historical work, because it's a really blended method, and it's one that is deeply personal, somewhat autobiographical, even if it doesn't come across that way in the written version. And it's also one that I had to be in ways that I hadn't been before, very conscientious about the ethics of the method in ways that I'll explain in a moment. So what is Atlantic? I think is a very important place to start, because Atlantic has a number of different meanings. It's again, like so many of the terms that we've already talked about today, it's got some slippery aspects to it. But suffice it to say, when you think about the Atlantic Ocean at a really basic level, people have found great value in trying to think through the movement of people, historical processes, the uniqueness of particular kinds of identities that are formed precisely because they're located in this space called the Atlantic. So it's an attempt to use geography and, in many cases, nautical history, diplomatic history, history of migration, to try to describe things that are oftentimes transnational and always, again, moving and evolving and developing. The thing about Atlantic that was important for me as a junior person, and I mean junior in the sense of like still being in grad school at the University of Michigan, was I encountered the work of people like Sidney Mintz, like Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot, like Philip D. Morgan. And as a grad student, all these people I noticed at the time had positions at Johns Hopkins University. And I was like, this has to be the place where people can do this kind of important Atlantic work. I'm very inspired by it. I'm a kid who was born in Connecticut but raised in Florida. I have grandparents who are from the Caribbean. I have great-grands who are from Europe. And so this made total sense to me as a way to understand the making of places and people and so forth. What I came to learn once I joined the faculty at Hopkins was, and this was in my really very first semester, was that Atlantic here meant something different than Atlantic over there, right? In some ways, it's a classic kind of Atlantic problem, right? The meaning shift depending on where you are. And so from the outside, Atlantic was deeply dynamic, deeply interesting, deeply important. Inside, Atlantic had a very embattled history. It was a site of bitter conflict that I'll explain. And it was one where one particular side won and decided that that's what Atlantic was going to be. And it wasn't really the side of Atlantic that I thought was blended, that was mixed methodology, anthro history, and all of that. All right, so the Atlantic myth, what is that as I encountered it here? What it is the notion that you have a history that is built around the work of Herbert Baxter Adams, who made these connections between Europe and the United States for deeply racialist purposes. But once you got rid of the racist parts, it was still very useful because you could have nautical historians and former military men from the 1940s making important connections between the empires of the North Atlantic and what eventually became the early modern world of the Americas. And this was a very exciting way of thinking through things, and it had a number of important luminaries, people like the great Jack Green and the hundreds of students that he produced. It had the series at Johns Hopkins University Press that produced an extraordinary number of volumes. And there was this momentum about Atlantic really being the backbone of our department. And there were certain Atlantic conversations that really did occupy the center of the discussion. And there were history stories that were told about how we as a department arrived at this point. Put that in a box. COVID comes, and you got to find a way to keep busy. I'm doing this project on the history of my family. And I wind up doing some work actually with Professor Jessica Marie Johnson on the history of this new thing we had called the Black World Seminar. And I began poking around the JHU newsletter and thinking about the history of the seminar as an intellectual space and how the Black World Seminar was a departure from the conventional seminar that we had. I come across this article from 1970. Genovese views the black. Now, this is a man by the name of Eugene Genovese. He's a very important historian who has a very complicated and embattled history with both the left and his own identity and African American history. But at this point in his story, in 1970, he's invited as a powerful voice and a guest to try to give some language to what is happening in the political moment, but in historical terms. Now, there is an incredible passage that's here. And I want to draw your attention to. Let me see if I can use this point. Oh, that didn't work. Okay. You see the pointer here, right? It's not going to point. Okay. Yeah, let me see if I can find it. Yes, here. So, this paragraph. The academic tone of the symposium was occasionally interrupted by shouts from black women in the audience. They apparently felt that the black situation was being oversimplified by the historians. Who are these black women? I have no idea. I still don't know. In talking to a number of people who were at the conference but don't remember, which I think is its own bizarre blind spot, people who were in the field at the time, people who were in the foundation sector, Baltimore locals, my impression is that the field of the history of slavery did not have yet, as it does now, an extraordinarily well-developed collection of people who were doing black women's slavery in the most conventional, history of slavery in the most conventional sense that we might now understand. And again, some would argue it's not conventional at all. The field didn't really have an identity yet, kind of slavery studies. You had people like Genovese who had written kind of big books on it and other very kind of embattled accounts about, paternalism and accommodation and so forth. But as the historian Peter Wood told me in an interview, we all were still figuring out what the hell we were doing. We didn't really have a sense of this. But this gave me a sense that there was a conversation that was being had in circles that were likely either high school teachers or librarians. Again, these are folks who are not part of formal academia, but are clearly reading scholarship and have a sense of what it means to talk about in the history of slavery. And more to the point, it gave me a window into a moment. And so in the essay that I write for this project, I talk about the late 60s and the early 70s as being a moment of profound interruptions. There are interruptions happening at conferences all the time. They're happening in Canada, in the US, in Britain. The late 60s, early 70s, there's very little decorum at academic proceedings. You all are very well behaved by contrast. I appreciate you. But this is what helped to inspire the method for this project, because I had to figure out what is the interruption as a form, and what is it about the myth of the Atlantic story that is in fact interrupted by these kinds of moments, but that also can be said to be interrupted by the presence of black scholars presently at Hopkins and the way in which the field is developing. And so in order to find interruptions, I had to at least take the thorn that was in my flesh about not knowing who these women were and think about other people who might have been coming through Johns Hopkins University, but their names didn't wind up in the bookshelf. Their faces didn't wind up on the seminar room wall. And so I ended up having a series of interviews with people and going back and reading some of the founding texts of the Atlantic moment or the Atlantic perspective, and my mind was immediately blown. Because one of the things that I learned right away was that this was not a field of nautical historians or people who were just interested in an abstract sense about diplomatic relations. The formation of the Atlantic field was completely rooted in the concerns about black power and desegregation. And the first book that was ever written from the so-called Atlantic perspective actually came out of this conference. It's a volume called Neither Slave Nor Free, edited by Jack Green and David Cohen, both of whom were on faculty at Johns Hopkins University. And they're very explicit in their footnotes and in the text that the primary issue is what do we do about race relations in America, and how do we figure out free black populations and their struggles as a way to offer us a lens for understanding the problem of racial incorporation and race relations now. There was nothing varnished about it. There was no equivocation. It was like, this is what needed to be done. More to the point, there was a way in which the JHU newsletter, as a source, jumped out as this incredible resource that had its thumb on the politics of the late 60s and early 70s. I didn't make a point in my first book of looking at student newspapers and trying to figure out what the University of Miami students thought about eminent domain or segregation and all of that. But here we had student journalists who were writing sophisticated pieces about tenure denials, about federal anti-discrimination policy, about conferences that were being interrupted. So again, these are not scholars in the formal sense, and yet they're narrating history. And so I had to develop a method that was able to locate missing people, think about the journalistic views of undergraduates, not just professional journalists, and in some ways to begin to stitch together this perspective that wasn't going to be answered through the usual scholarship on the so-called Atlantic perspective. Now comes the interesting part. And I have to apologize to my comrades and dear friends who have heard me tell this story 99 times, but you got to hear it. The telling is important. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a moment that most of us have no knowledge of and there's no popular conversation about. And this is where the importance of understanding federal anti-discrimination enforcement becomes critical for understanding what's happening inside of the halls of academia. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was empowered by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, by Supreme Court decisions between the Brown decision and the decision in 1968 called Green versus Kent County, not necessarily important, but it was also empowered by a population of people who, in the winning of the election of 1968 by Richard Nixon, understood themselves to be anti-racist Republicans. That was a thing, it was real. People believed that their job was to be the natural adversaries of Southern Democrats, and they took their job very seriously. And so there was a lawyer who worked in HEW by the name of Leon Panetta, who made it a point to impound federal funds from 131 educational institutions, including private universities like Columbia that had $70 million of its money in 1969 currency impounded by HEW. I know this story because they wrote about it in the JHU newsletter, right? Most of the dominant scholarship on the story of the late 60s, early 70s doesn't even talk about this. But at the time, people were gripped by the concern that the federal government would come and take your shit. And they were doing it, and they were doing it. So it's an important story about Black revolt, it's an important story about campus protests, but just as important, if not more important, is a story about the power of the federal government to sap the federal dollars that were underneath so many different projects in higher education. This matters because at Johns Hopkins University, the Atlantic perspective becomes a way of helping historians navigate the problem of Black militancy, as evidenced by something like this moment in 1970, and also become compliant with the federal government's concerns about desegregating their institutions. They developed an approach that basically said, okay, we've got this guy who does early America and the US colonies, or sorry, the British colonies in the Caribbean. We've got this guy, again, both white, who studies Central Africa, and this guy who studies East Africa as scholars currently on faculty. What do all these folks have in common? Black people, okay? How do we come up with a concept, a frame that allows all of us to bring students into the campus and into the graduate programs and possibly onto the faculty as professors? We developed this perspective called Atlantic. You can follow the grant proposals in the Rockefeller Foundation files, attempts that are trying to get Ford Foundation money, that show that Atlantic wasn't even used in the first drafts of the report. That came later as they were trying to find some kind of sanitized frame to make all the project hold together, because you couldn't just say the Negro Desegregation Initiative, right? You had to basically come up with something that had intellectual gloss. So this becomes the move. The Atlantic program becomes the way of going after specifically West Indian students who were in the University of the West Indies, who are seemingly not as political as their American counterparts who are occupying buildings, It becomes the way to go after Africanists, many of whom are in the military, and there's a man by the name of Ray Key who gets hired in 1971, and there is an effort to try as best they can to bring in people like Franklin Knight, who's hired just after Key, people like John Russell Wood, who does Portuguese language, Black World, in the same year, in 73, and this becomes their moment, their Atlantic moment, okay? Now, what I want to do is, I told our contributors to hold themselves to 12 minutes. I think Sanchita is the only one who totally did it, and now I'm feeling bad because I'm going to totally go over. But I want to just share a little bit because it's really important, again, thinking about the methodology, that I share with you a little bit of the voice of the people who are coming into the university as it's doing this desegregation, okay? And so I had the opportunity to talk to Ray Key, the first Black faculty member hired in the humanities and social sciences at Johns Hopkins University. I talked to him by phone, and he helped to give some texture for this account. In 1971, Ray Key was hired the way faculty were then. No job talk, just an interview. It's either David Cohen or Green I spoke to in London, he recalled, and there was nothing said about my being the first African American to be in the history department. Green and Cohen did, however, sell Key on the new scholarly approach in the offing at Hopkins. They said, quote, "The Atlantic programs would attract students, a wide range of students, minority students in particular. I thought it sounded pretty exciting. So I packed up my things and with my family moved to Baltimore, and it was really because of the program, because I had little sense of what Hopkins was all about. Although," he continued, I did get a sense of it by the first month or so. It only took about a month. African American women serving the professors, members of the faculty club, Key described the whole scene as, quote, "done in the pseudo-Southern, gentlemanly, racist sort of way." That combined with housing discrimination, informed slights with colleagues in the department, and 1,000 other indignities, it all made the atmosphere, in Key's words, absolutely repulsive. Racism varies at institutions across the country, Key would remark to student reporters in 1980, but it takes a particularly strong and subtle form at Hopkins. I went to too many faculty cocktail parties where one says, I teach at Hopkins, and sees the disbelief on their white colleagues' faces. I was really tempted to say, well, I made a mistake coming here, even though I was still excited about the Atlantic program. He planned on taking off that very first year, just leaving and returning to London. Key would stay, and he would try to advance his work on the kingdoms and really the polities of Ghana in the 16th and 17th century. Marxist approaches to history were very much in vogue in that time, and he was trying to bring, in some ways, not dissimilar from people like Walter Rodney of somewhat greater renown, Marxist perspectives to the understanding of African history. The other thing that was important to keep in mind is that the Atlantic perspective was a multidisciplinary perspective, and so Jack Green, who helped to create this initiative, became the first chair and the founder of the anthropology department at Hopkins as well. And so anthropology and history developed together, and Green went out of his way to go recruit Sidney Mintz, a very important Caribbeanist who worked on worker and peasant movements in Puerto Rico, Richard Price, who did Marinage in Suriname and elsewhere, and try to stitch together a Caribbean-centered approach to the Atlantic world. He also went out and got the hire of a man by the name of Phil Curtin, who I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. But again, suffice it to say that one of the things that was so extraordinary in my conversations and in my reading about the Atlantic program in the 70s is that the combination of broader geopolitical formations and the reading practices inside of the university itself made Atlantic studies a decidedly decolonial enterprise. People were interested in finding ways to understand free blacks, peasant movements, other kinds of anti-racist struggles, nationalist movements in comparative frame, looking at early 20th century, not just the early modern period. And that was in some ways the world that I had encountered in later form bibliographically as a graduate student, but I could see it happening here. There was a very talented woman who was a student activist at Howard University by the name of Adrienne Mans. She would come in as somebody who aspired to do African history. And there was a dynamism that included people like Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot, Brackett Williams, and a number of very prominent voices in the field of Caribbean studies. The importance of Ray Key in all of these formations can't be overstated because he ends up being a very important resource for these graduate students. and many of them looked to him as a mentor and as a guide. There, at the same time, was a kind of ad hoc quality to all of this. There wasn't a real intentionality behind it. And so this is something that Adrienne Mans encounters when she comes to the institution, and I want to read a little bit here. One of the first challenges seemed to be the sparseness of women and the minimal black presence. When we had those Atlantic seminars, Adrienne Mans recalled, there would be very few women or faculty or students, and for color, there would be me from history, a black woman student in anthropology, Franklin Knight and Ray Key. Occurrences of black students disappearing from the program had also become accepted as commonplace. Adrienne Mans remembers the lone black woman in anthropology, quote, talking to me and telling me that they weren't going to let both of us finish. The place in itself, another black graduate student recounted, Bernard Moy, was not conducive at all to one's development. There was a kind of hazing culture where certain faculty members would let in far too many students and then just through attrition, see who would kind of make the gauntlet all the way to the end, right? The experience of Adrienne Mans warrants pointed recounting. Long before getting married and changing her last name to Israel, so Adrienne Mans Israel, Adrienne Mans had been an undergraduate at Howard University between 1964 and 1968, very critical years to be at Howard. She hadn't been at the 1970 Johns Hopkins conference where shouts from black women interrupted the academic tone of the symposium. Mans belonged nonetheless to the wider moment of black people challenging dominant uses of history. It's not enough to talk about past glory, she once argued, when pressing problems of the black community are apparent just outside the gates of the campus. Again, that presentism is importantly shaping how she's thinking about things. Those words appeared in 1968 when Mans had been the lead organizer in the student takeover of Howard University's Central Administrative Building. I came out of those demonstrations intending to be a journalist, Mans recalled. The next several years consisted of participating in and reporting on black power politics. Mans then went to the Baltimore Afro-American, where at only 23 years old, again, another very precocious 23-year-old, she became the acting city editor of the Baltimore Afro-American. There, she covered, among other stories, the trial of H. Rap Brown and the murder of Fred Hampton. She also continued her organizing work, what she described as odd jobs, which included work with Marion Barry's Pride, Inc. in Washington, D.C., marching on the Pentagon to oppose the war in Vietnam, teaching college courses, championing the release of Angela Davis from prison, writing freelance, and picking up a master's degree in African history from Howard. Then one of my professors at Howard recommended going to Hopkins to study with Philip Curtin, she recalls. In the interest of time, I'm going to simply skip ahead and say the following. It's critical to note that over the course of these developments, as people are trying to work their way through these scholarly landmines and think about institutional landmines, that the courts themselves are gutting the old enforcement regime of the early 1970s and late 1960s. In 1978, there's a decision that's very well known at this point, Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California, that basically turns the requirements of anti-discrimination enforcement and its punitive measures in terms of money seizure into something that's pretty much just voluntary and elective, about kind of diversity in a very abstract and somewhat, toothless sense. Almost immediately, you begin to see shifts in the Atlantic program itself. And the decolonial character that marked this early period moves ever so slightly higher by higher, attrition after attrition as graduate students are coming through, into a decidedly pro-imperial frame. So that by the time you get to the 1980s, what you see is work that is not focused on decolonial movements or black connections, but instead focused on French Empire, Dutch Empire, Spanish Empire, British Empire. And you can track it through the foundations and their applications. You can see it in the money that's being asked for from the deans. It's an incredible transformation, and it's one of the things that then leads to the storytelling about the Atlantic program's genealogy, because they look at this moment in the 80s and say, this is what we always were, when in fact, the very practitioners who founded the program give you a contrary story. Now, I'll spare you a lot of the interpersonal pieces because it gets really gossipy and kind of dishy, but I do want to just skip ahead to point out the fact that once you have no federal guidelines, the academic star system kicks in, and people become very abusive. There's almost Adrienne Mans Israel goes through an extraordinarily difficult time with her then advisor who abandons her. She finds a way to still finish her degree nonetheless, but then realizes that she's so traumatized by the experience of having her funding threatened, by having her advisor basically recommend she go into dangerous fieldwork situations, by not getting any support to the intellectual journey that brought her into grad school in the first place, that when on a later trip to Baltimore to kind of visit with a friend who asked her to visit the old campus, Adrienne Mans can't even turn her wheel to go onto the Hopkins campus. It's that much of an embodied hardship. And so there is, in some ways, a kind of thinning out of the Atlantic perspective. There's a way in which the Anthro people become, a little bit more disaffected. And Phil Curtin makes up his mind that he's going to go after Ray Key. And he rides his colleagues to vote against Ray Key. He sends all kinds of letters of condemnation. He takes all kinds of deans to lunch. He threatens to leave the institution if Key isn't denied tenure. And again, I'm telling you this in very kind of quick fashion, but understand that it took several months of field work and cross-referencing and to figure out who said what to whom, where are the documents. I've got all kind of confidential stuff I can't even share with people because there are a lot of very grumpy old fellas who were like, here's this letter I got from 1979 to show you that I actually fought for this, that, and the third, right? So Key gets denied tenure, and he's so angry about what happened at Hopkins and the way he was kind of driven out that he throws himself into his work. He decides that he is going to basically show the people at Hopkins that he didn't deserve to be denied tenure. And the way he describes it to me, and this is a very important kind of causal move, is he says, then my son committed suicide, his 16-year-old son. And upon that event, I burned my manuscripts. So textual analysis being what it is, you can imagine that in Key's own mind, his workaholism had some relationship to the tragedy that occurred. Right? He then tries to get another job at Carleton, which he does, then tries to get another job at UC Riverside, which he eventually does. But Phil Curtin is writing letters of condemnation after Ray Key and all these other places that he's deciding to go. And the hounding of Key basically splinters the Atlantic program to the point where many of the anthropologists no longer try to, associate with him. The assassination of Walter Rodney is a brief moment of collegiality and comradeship, but again, they write a kind of open letter and condemning Rodney's assassination, but it can't hold together. This is the last little bit of I'll get into. So, sorry, Sanchita. So, one of the graduate students who has come through this program is Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot. And by the time you get to the late 80s and early 1990s, Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot has become a big deal, okay? He was already a very brilliant, scholar. Sidney Mintz basically found Trouillot because Trouillot was a cab driver in New York. And he was a musician, and he'd already written a book in Haitian Creole about the Haitian Revolution. And Sidney Mintz like, you're brilliant, you gotta come to Hopkins and go to grad school. So Trouillot takes off, he gets a job at Duke. He comes back to Hopkins as the first Krieger Eisenhower Distinguished Professor of African descent in the university's history. And he immediately comes back and he becomes the head of the Atlantic program and proceeds to rename it and completely shut down the old approach. And it becomes a program in global studies. And I tend to think about this as the revenge of Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot, because if you read Trouillot's considerably most famous book, Silencing the Past, and read between the lines, you see that in fact he's having very real conflicts with Caribbeanists and Atlanticists who were at Johns Hopkins at that time. And I don't know if he's carrying a grad student grudge, now he's a bigwig, but it's a very clear binary. Trouillot eventually goes to the University of Chicago. He splits ways with his former advisors. Is a whole other kind of gossipy moment. And Trouillot basically is one of the people that inspires me, again, bibliographically, to come to Hopkins. Coda, final chapter. When I arrive in Hopkins, the Atlantic myth is already full-blown, and people talk about it as being like the genius of Jack Green that kind of created this thing, or it's his earlier history in terms of nautical studies, but there's no appreciation whatsoever of the political making of this field. And of all the people who have gone out to take jobs in the Atlantic field, and again, I'm talking literally triple-digit numbers of doctoral students who shaped the face of the academy in this particular sub-area, and folks who work in that area can attest to this fact. But what happens in the meantime is that, and this is important to the character of Racism and Repair, it becomes clear that if you can find a way to locate this history and narrate this history in the context of departmental proceedings, a lot of the storytelling that historians do, a lot of the myth-making that even the most decorated historians do, it evaporates like so much fog. There's nothing that they can say. And between 2016 and the moment I'm addressing you now, we went from having a department that had no black faculty members, because I was away at NYU and I was out of here, and I came back, to having 8 tenured black faculty members in the Department of History. between 2016 and really, some of them have been here for a few years now. So really between like 2016 and like 2021, right? So like a 5-year period. And it had everything to do with the willingness of colleagues in the department to engage the history of their own discipline, and also to realize that there wasn't a whole lot that they had to stand on once you started doing the research and the evidence. So in closing, I would say that this experience of figuring out how the story of the Atlantic field has been sanitized and whitewashed has been such a compelling experience in how even the loftiest, most decorated, most credentialed people in a field that they know very well can oftentimes fall back into basically telling bedtime stories. And a lot of the things that I'm hearing, even from my colleagues in the medical field, is that so many of the assumptions that are having profound policy implications are oftentimes just connected to these stories that people are telling without a whole lot of evidence, and they're just kind of hardwired into their system. And so I look forward to the conversation and sharing a little bit more about the project. But I'm also very thankful to have you all here, to be a part of Racism Repair. And again, just to my co-conspirators and collaborators in this, I'm very excited about what this move toward a kind of political history in the broadest sense can do. So thank you all very much.
Hi, everybody. I think I'm going to try to be the second to do a 12-minute thing. I've been setting a timer.
Thank you.
So I just want to start by echoing people's thanks for the organizers, for Stuart and Nathan and Shantae and everyone involved. There's been a lot of rhetoric in higher ed over the last few years about addressing racism within the academy and understanding the roots of our own institutions, but there hasn't been a lot of action, and there hasn't been a lot of willingness to kind of expose potentially embarrassing and humiliating and damning facts about the places that we all work and teach and learn. So I think, Hopkins can be really commended for this, or I should say, this part of the institution of Hopkins should be commended for that, and let's hope it makes people at the top uncomfortable, because that's when we know it'll be working. So what I want to talk about today is one of the, I think, important ways in which racism is made an everyday fact of a lot of people's lives, which is the way that hierarchies around the idea of race become rendered or understood as natural, or are sort of presented as scientific facts. One of the most important ways I think that gets done in the United States today, and has been for the last century, is around this extremely dubious metric called IQ, or intelligence quotient. So the idea that there are large and stable differences between groups of people that can be helpfully described as Black, Asian, and white, and that these differences are resistant to any kind of a reform or amelioration, and therefore any attempts at educational sort of uplift are doomed from the start, has become, an extremely durable way of discrediting and discounting any efforts at changing the way that this country in particular works. And if anyone has been following the Richard Hanania furore for the last couple of months, you'll see that this idea of IQ racism is hardly something from the early 1900s or the late 19th century. It's alive and well. It's being funded much better than sickle cell research is being funded in many cases, let's put it that way. And sometimes from within academic institutions like George Mason University, which, for example, is directly funding the dubious IQ blogging of a young, self-taught scientific racist of the 21st century. The unfortunate fact is that Hopkins has a kind of a special role in this story. In the second half of the 20th century, especially from the 1970s into the 2000s, it's been a kind of often unrecognized node for the so-called pro-differences camp amongst psychologists and sociologists who believe against the kind of mainstream drift of conversation that there is something objective called race, that can be used to sort people and to make confident assumptions about their capacity as humans. I think this can be understood basically as a continuation of a eugenics project in both a kind of a negative and a positive form. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of the history of this, the personalities involved, and the way that this logic that I sort of am bluntly labeling here as weed the worst, boost the best, has been promoted by certain tenured, often long-standing members of the Johns Hopkins faculty. So the story begins with someone who is quite well known and is often held up as kind of a paragon of applied social science research, a fellow named James S. Coleman, who came to Hopkins in 1959 and founded something called the Department of Social Relations, which was itself based on a similar department at Harvard, was seeking to create a kind of like a unified Department of Social Sciences, was fairly well funded by outside philanthropic foundations, and was seen as kind of the forefront of the way that education should be going and higher ed research should be going. He was also, as a sidebar, involved in a counterinsurgency program called Project Camelot, about which I could be giving a whole other presentation. But he's most well known for his production of something called the Equality of Educational Opportunity Report, often simply known as the Coleman Report. And just Googling around about this, I saw even a recent hire in the sociology department at Hopkins cited reading this as an undergrad as his own inspiration for becoming a sociology professor. So the Coleman Report, and don't worry, I'm not about to expose it as sort of a racist creed or anything, screed. But what it did was it ended up offering the kind of social scientific rationale for what became desegregation through busing, right, to put it very simply. That's often how it's remembered. This was a way that social scientists sort of lent themselves to a large-scale effort to understand educational outcomes in a way that policy could begin to try to undo some of the historically ingrained inequalities in this country. What it's less often remembered for is that it was also the first thing to really put the idea of testing at the kind of forefront of the idea of how you can judge policy as succeeding or failing. So everything we know about sort of teaching to the test and sort of the fetishization of standardized testing also has its starting point with the Coleman Report. And secondly, often sort of underplayed in the more heroic narratives, Coleman himself kind of called his own conclusions into question not long after the beginning of desegregation through busing. He started to wonder if that was actually an effective way to fix educational outcomes. It seemed actually, according to his own data, that a lot of what was happening in terms of unequal outcomes were things that happened before students even got to school. So it might have something to do more with things that were happening in the home, whether it was early childhood, whether it was nutrition. But in fact, the idea that he came in, gave the data to fix inequality in American schools is like far-fetched and yet frequently repeated. So there were some people who read the results of the Coleman Report to reinforce the notion that because it happened before they entered the schoolhouse, there must be something sort of in the students themselves. So the idea of a kind of innate inequality in capacity to learn amongst American populations was also sort of given more credence in some readings of the Coleman Report. One of the people who would eventually come around to that view is sort of like the anti-hero of this story, a fellow named Robert Gordon, who was also in Hyde Park at the same time as James Coleman, himself studying young gang members, interested in what he called social anomie as a kind of quantifiable metric that you could study and sort of understand levels of delinquency and crime through. He was the first hire in Coleman's Department of Social Relations in 1963 and had a pretty solid tenure here at Hopkins, taught here until 2005. So Gordon at first was a pretty typical liberal. He was, he had probably the ambient acceptance of the legitimacy of racial labels that many of his peers would have had. But he did have some idea that the state could intervene positively to produce better outcomes, that racial equality was a realizable kind of horizon. And in fact, in the late 1960s, he was kind of an ally for the black community here in Baltimore, often standing up against things like the blaming of black business owners for the state of their own businesses, standing up against police violence during the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, and advocating for the idea that, that militant black politicians, often considered beyond the pale by some of his colleagues, should actually be taken seriously, given city council seats, and so on. So there was nothing really that marked him as any different than Coleman, if you would have sort of seen him as another Coleman. Until 1969, when he read this paper, which is really, if you know anything about the history of IQ racism in the United States, this is really the most important document in the second half of the 20th century anyway, which is by the Berkeley psychologist Arthur Jensen, over a 100-page article in the Harvard Educational Review called "How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement?" I pulled out kind of a kernel quote here. The ideal of equality of educational opportunity should not be interpreted as uniformity of facilities, instructional techniques, and educational aims for all children. So this report is now sort of like the totemic document for people who are against what is often called the kind of blank slate concept of human nature, from this point right up to Steven Pinker, the idea that there are sort of inequalities of capacity that we have to respect. To expect everyone to get up to the same level of achievement is naive. There's softer versions of that probably most people in this room would agree with, but in the context of this report's publication, it became the basis for something very similar to what Nathan described a minute ago, but in a different direction, which is it served as a kind of manifesto for kind of a counterinsurgency against things that were happening inside of the university. So because this was at the moment of federally enforced equality initiatives, it was the beginning of the move towards affirmative action. It was the beginning of the move towards trying to increase the ratios of black students on Hopkins campus. It's the beginning of militancy around ethnic studies and black studies and other campuses. The use of this Jensen report became a way to sort of like beat back and slap back at efforts to produce like a genuine equality in the university and in the country. From that moment onward, from 1969, really until his retirement in 2005 and even beyond, Gordon became a part of this like ever more belligerent pro-differences camp, which insisted on the impossibility of equal outcomes and insisted on the validity of group differences based on race. And one of his refrains, this is the negative eugenics side, that he repeated in classes on race and intelligence until the 2000s when he stopped teaching, was that the only way that you would actually get positive change in educational outcomes in this country would be if black communities started to voluntarily reduce reproduction of the less intelligent parts of their population. This was a claim that was, scandalous from decade to decade, to the point that at least on a couple of occasions, the head of department responding to complaints sent people in to observe his classes, and with the hope that that they would find out he wasn't saying this and the students were exaggerating or something. They found out that he was indeed saying that, but in the one report that I can quote from here quickly, the junior professor, a white woman who was sent in there to kind of observe the class, actually defended the statements that he was making. Let's see. Okay, she said, so this came up in the class when she posed a question to Gordon. Said, since the 1960s, we've been telling the disadvantaged that the disadvantage can be erased in time through environmental manipulation. If what you are suggesting is true, she said to the professor, it cannot. What do you think should be done? His reply was that disadvantaged groups should encourage reproduction among their higher IQ members and discourage reproduction among lower IQ members. She, amazingly to me, says to the head of department that this seemed like a perfectly rational conclusion from the evidence that he was providing, and she hadn't learned anything in the class that taught her that it should be otherwise. So his response to that, you can see here in a peer-reviewed publication that he published, where he said, some observers appear to confuse gradual changes in frequency of certain genotypes within a population with genocide. He was frequently charged with calling for genocide. Large IQ differences and changing demographics place racial ethnic groups on a socio-political collision course. Before lead time and goodwill are squandered altogether, it might behoove us to begin giving the various potential scenarios reasoned consideration. This in the pages of a peer-reviewed psychology journal. Not a very reputable one for that, but nevertheless. So this is his refrain for so many years. He finds a comrade in a woman named Linda Gottfredson, who first came to Hopkins, married to a psych professor named Gary Gottfredson. She split up with him, ended up with Gordon, and the two of them start to try to find funding for this project of studying race and intelligence together. They find it from something called the Pioneer Fund, which, if you know anything about the history of racial science and psychology, you know was sort of like the primary funder for the idea of racial differences in intelligence after the Third Reich, when most of these ideas sort of fell out of favor for political and scientific reasons. They get money from the Pioneer Fund, and they kickstart something called the Project on Race and Intelligence, the launch event of which was a panel discussion at the American Psychology Association, to which they invited Charles Murray, who at that time wasn't writing about race and IQ at all. He had written a book called Losing Ground, for which he got a lot of attention, but it's completely based on behavioral psychology. It's not based on sort of cognitive psychology or differences in group differences in intelligence. In fact, in Losing Ground, he goes out of his way to say, I'm not talking about IQ, I'm not saying that black people are less intelligent than white people, they're just responding to incentives, and anyone would, squander their money if they got a welfare check and didn't have to account for it, and so on. He leaves this meeting with Gottfredson and Gordon. Richard Herrnstein is also on the panel, convinced by them that indeed there is a strong and defensible link between racial differences in IQ, and from there literally begins writing the bell curve with Herrnstein, which is published a few years later, stays on the New York Times bestseller list for 10 months, sells 800,000 copies, brings back, I think it's not too hard to say, the sort of credibility of the scientific premises for racial hierarchy in ways that were more consequential than any other publication of the last 25 years. So the reference at the beginning of my paper to sort of Johns Hopkins at the two ends of the bell curve is intended in a couple of ways. One, it's there at the beginning. It sort of helps start the bell curve in this sense. Afterwards, Gottfredson and Gordon mobilize in defense of the bell curve and its criticisms. So Gottfredson is the lead author on this statement that's published full page in the New York Times, the mainstream Science on Intelligence, saying all of their work is legit, it's all sound, it's watertight. And then also, they use this as a way to get more funding from the Pioneer Fund for this project for the study of intelligence in society, which, although officially rejected by the Hopkins administration to be hosted at Hopkins, they nevertheless go ahead and create letterhead for and put Hopkins logo right up at the top, and pretty an extraordinary act of sort of affront to the ability of the institution to oversee the production that's happening within its own walls and within its own departments. The other reason why I say the other end of the bell curve. Oh, well, let me just share this quote to put a sharper point on it. If that center had been established, the one they made the letterhead for anyway, Gottfredson and I would have written a book that would have been the equivalent of the bell curve, he claimed. We would have led the nation in the scientific study of this topic in sociology. Instead, this nation lost 8 years of lead time, he says in 1994. So to wrap up, I want to talk about the other end of the bell curve, meaning if we think about distribution of IQ, suggesting people of less intelligence on the left-hand side, then there is also the other side of the bell curve, people of exceptionally high intelligence. And that's where the positive eugenics comes in. Julian Stanley is someone who is well known on this campus, the campus of Hopkins. The Julian C. Stanley Study of Exceptional Talent, SET, bears his name, or bore his name from 1991. And he was also a psychologist. According to Gordon and Gottfriedson, it was Stanley who first persuaded them of the idea of ironclad links between racial groups and intelligence. But instead of pushing for negative eugenics, voluntary low reproduction amongst Black communities and their exposure to study, which is what Gordon was asking, he decided to do the other side of weeding out the worst and seeking to boost the best. So he was virulently opposed to the mobilization of Black studies as a demand on campus. This is a telling quote that I know that Professor Connolly has used in the past too, talking about lowering admission standards for Black applicants. Quote, "If you dip much lower than that, as quite likely most of you have been doing in recent years, you sow the seeds for a really segregated institution and for the Black Studies department's functioning as a cell for further revolution." So his efforts at creating these things, the study of mathematically precocious youth, was quite literally an attempt at counterinsurgency against efforts at more just Black presence on campus, both literally in terms of the percentage of students, which at 3% he thought was too high based on what he saw as intelligence ratios and where the curve should be overlapping with how smart you have to be to get into Hopkins. And two, through creating what became the most well-known talent search effort, whereby large numbers of students, by 5 years into its operations, hundreds of thousands of students had been taking SAT tests as middle school students to see if their results were high enough for them to be accelerated quickly into college and to skip over a couple of grades. So he becomes kind of the poster child or the figurehead of this new movement of the exceptional and gifted programs, which I'm sure many people in this room either were in or are familiar with. In closing, it's very interesting to me, one of the things that I didn't expect while researching this was to see how actually controversial that idea was of like gifted child programs and exceptional child programs. When he was setting these up, there was backlash. People were saying, this is unfair, you're giving a leg up to people who already have a leg up. Why can't they just excel within normal classroom environments like everyone else? You're kind of segregating and siloing out students that could be helping other students. But of course, I think by now, the universal kind of embrace of meritocracy combined with perhaps implicit acceptance of some kind of pre-existing capacity that is unequally distributed in the population means that such an idea of giving a leg up to people who already have a leg up. I think the joke made in the New York Times was it's like letting Kareem Abdul-Jabbar play on a ladder or something bizarre, like 1970s style reference point, is no longer seen as strange at all. The acts of, so positive and negative eugenics, the idea of the primacy of science, the ability of science to speak in a transparent way about the supposed facts of us as humans, have obviously gone nowhere, and it's a sad fact that people like Gordon and Gottfriedson, if you Google them and look around, are praised now as sort of like bold truth tellers for what is now called, the alt-right or the resurgent scientific racist movement. So Hopkins has that legacy to share with the world as well. Thank you. All right.
Hi, everyone. I wish I had caffeine for you all, but I'll be brief, and then we're all going to gather at the end. So my name's Tali. I'm a postdoc here with the program. I want to thank you all for an incredible group of presentations. It's a true honor to discuss this body of research and think collectively about the history of the arts and social sciences at Hopkins and the racial politics that are at the heart of their institutional development. So a particularly important thread that ties this work together, at least as I see it, is a deeper understanding of the relationship between the institutional politics of the university and the national landscape shaping these politics, and then the intellectual agenda of the university. So you all teach us in different ways what we research, how we research, and the very theoretical paradigms that potentiate this research are deeply influenced by a racial order, an order that not only has a deep historical legacy, but is actively reproducing itself in the present. This order is not just ideological in nature, though this type of racism obviously plays a critically important role, but material racism as well, carved into the university by streams of funding, regulation, and incentivization, or a lack thereof, and even through the materiality of the past that the university represents in its museums. The racial order defines the story that Hopkins has told and continues to tell about itself. We learn how national political and intellectual trends define the work being done in these respective departments, the very definitions of history and futurity that guide this work, and most importantly, how we can begin to imagine the forms of political pressure that can change this intellectual work and move it in the direction of repair at Johns Hopkins and beyond. So I'll offer some brief highlights of these phenomenal papers and then end with some questions and provocations for each scholar and some thoughts about the collective project as a whole. Here comes the name part. Okay, Dr. Quinn Slobodian teaches us about the critical role that Johns Hopkins Department of Social Relations played in the conservative race and IQ eugenics-inspired research movement, dubbed the pro-differences camp, that argued affirmative action movements would fail due to biological differences in hereditary intelligence. These logics are glossed as weed the worst and boost the best. In his words, Hopkins scholars promoted a logic of quarantine, indefinite sentencing, and soft antinatalist eugenics for the least intelligent, and a logic of search, selection, and acceleration for those judged most intelligent through testing. So by following a group of academics, Robert A. Gordon, Linda Gottfredson, and Julian Stanley, Dr. Slobodian reveals the major role that Johns Hopkins played in the intelligence research movement, and that this kind of research and education was authorized by Johns Hopkins University into the 1990s. Dr. Tara Bynum can't be with us here today, but I thought she was going to be here, and I thought I would keep a short summary of her work given that she appeared in Dr. Nathan Connolly's opening remarks. So Dr. Bynum's work reveals that Johns Hopkins was at the helm of the broader political and economic processes that shaped Baltimore at the turn of the 20th century. Through a web of social and political relationships between elite, wealthy white men, Johns Hopkins University, first as the country school for boys and Johns Hopkins Business School, were connected with the B&O Railroad and other major economic forces, cultural and civil society forces, like the Municipal Arts Society, and to state forces through connections with branches of Baltimore city government. Together, as an emergent, predatory, urban capitalist political economy, they dispossessed countless poor Black communities and remapped the city for the enrichment, both social, intellectual, and financial, of wealthy white families in Baltimore. Their children were then to learn a particular version of history, a distorted tale about how they came to be where they were and how Baltimore became their home at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Sanchita Balachandran takes us into the heart of the Archaeological Museum on campus that houses archaeological objects largely from ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Walking us through the material objects, their curation, and the pedagogical history of this museum organization, she shows us that the collection offers a Western, white, Aryan version of history that prepared classically trained men at Hopkins to chart an American, white future. In this research, the objects, their presentations, and the disciplinary knowledge that has been produced and taught about them all work to construct a particular version of ancient history. This history then charts the future that Johns Hopkins imagines itself stewarding as a political and a pedagogical institution. And finally, Dr. Nathan Connolly takes us on a historical tour de force of the program in Atlantic history, culture, and society at Johns Hopkins, which tells a story not only about the training of now infamous scholars of Caribbean and Latin American history, but about its historical and institutional underpinnings. It's a story of public federal investment that allowed for the program's development, yet also of private evasion that allowed it to maintain conservative white interests while resisting the second Reconstruction forces of the 1960s and 70s civil rights era. Connolly shows us that the Black Atlantic program was Johns Hopkins' vehicle to take advantage of the revolutionary political moment, yet intentionally and strategically thwart the scholars who came through the program, to thwart what he calls the transformative potential of their presence and the polarizing past that their presence called into being. This dynamic relationship between intellectual agendas and the disciplines that potentiate these agendas, together with the very institutional infrastructure that these disciplines rely upon, is what I want to think a bit more about with you all today. So tasked with thinking through potential policy demands that could begin the work of repair or reparation for this harm, I think it's important to dream big, and these dreams start with more questions. So some of these questions are concrete, but in their concreteness, I think, lies really important ways that we can understand these historical legacies as living in the present, springing with potentiality and the possibility of change. In Dr. Slobodian's research, we learn about the intelligence research that the Department of Social Relations sponsored at Johns Hopkins, a search for essential biological differences that explain social and economic disparities between racial groups. I couldn't help but notice that the Ford and Spencer Foundation supported this research, two major funders that continue to fund research in the educational and social sciences today. I wondered about how we might think about the legacy of this research through the different institutions that funded it, mapping out political implication through financial investment in this kind of science, but also mapping the continued presence of this lineage of ideas through these types of financial flows. I was also especially curious about the relationship that you see between eugenicist science, the form of intelligence research that you studied, and contemporary forms of genetics-based social research. This is a terrifying, very active form of research that continues to look for the genetic origins of social problems like addiction, educational attainment, and children's behavioral issues. Where do we draw the lines of harm in the scientific study of difference? Are there any lines to draw? And of course, I'm particularly interested in this question as an anthropologist. And how might these social scientific insights be integrated in medical and clinical science classrooms that study the biological or hereditary nature of difference? In sum, I'm really wondering about the vital legacy of the Department of Social Relations at Hopkins and across elite universities today in both the medical and social sciences, and how we might address that legacy. Dr. Sanchita Balachandran's research expertly weaves together the material and institutional history of Johns Hopkins through the Archaeological Museum on campus. A question that kept coming to mind as I was reading is, how do we seek justice or repair in material representation through objects, their curation, and the stories they tell? My mind kept returning to the difference between historically accurate history and a reparative history, a museum's collection that doesn't just get the story right, but could also repair the harm that white supremacist history enacts. So this calls to mind contemporary debates on renaming, removing, or rewriting the cultural vestiges, statues, building names, and memorial sites that tell a history of a racial order through our built environments. And I'm curious about how you understand the frames of these debates and their potential for this kind of reparative material history. And finally, Dr. Connolly details the role that the federal government played in integrating Black faculty and students at elite universities, shifting the intellectual agenda of the history department, among others, at the university. So we spoke about this a bit at the last symposium, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the kinds of funding structure that you think would best support BIPOC intellectual independence in the contemporary university. Where would the money come from? Is it public or private? And what structures of accountability could we fight for to ensure that it were spent in the right way and lead to the development, hiring, and retention of BIPOC graduate students and faculty? As I read your work, I also continued to return to the idea of placing pressure on the Hopkins administration to award honorary tenure, degrees, and awards for intellectual innovation, and public apologies to Ray Key and other Black faculty and graduate students who were harassed, degraded, and ultimately exiled from the social sciences at Johns Hopkins. This, in certain ways, feels like a meaningless symbolic gesture, but my wheels kept spinning on the idea of a struggle for intellectual and personal freedom in academic institutions, in memorializing this struggle, and how you imagine that struggle to be unique or similar to other struggles for racial justice in different kinds of institutions. So this then leads me to a brief series of questions for the group to conclude. How do you all imagine this relationship between disciplinary change, or changing the intellectual culture and the type of knowledge produced within the different social sciences, and broader change at the level of university administration? And when we think about this idea of reparative history, where do we imagine that history being housed, memorialized, and enacted within the university, both as a material built environment, but also as a political structure of labor, hierarchy, and power? So I want to thank each of you for this incredible research and state again that these questions, I think, are just the beginning of the political dreams sewed into these histories that have a real power to shift the predatory and deeply exploitative role that elite universities like Johns Hopkins currently play in our cities, in our communities, and that could help us imagine different futures. It's only with these imagined futures, I think, that a retrospective path for justice and repair really becomes clear. So thanks so much.
Okay, we have some time for questions from the audience. Some questions over here.
Good afternoon, Wally Gill. I have a question for the second presenter regarding Robert A. Gordon. His views on, it seems like he was pushing very subtly for an educational form of eugenics. And I guess the key word between the difference between Margaret Sanger and he was voluntary. Would you speak on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. No, it was completely unspecified how that was supposed to happen. I don't know even what he had in mind, that there would be a kind of communal process by which, I mean, I literally don't know like what he expected the Black community to get together and sort of choose. I mean, it's absurd on the face of it, right? I mean, it's. But I think it tells us something that it makes so little sense, right? I mean, it was intended as a provocation, right? It wasn't actually intended as really a policy suggestion or anything like some kind of strange, misplaced good faith gesture. It was intended to cross a series of red lines in discourse to kind of show to his listener how much he didn't care about convention, I think. Do you know what I mean? So I don't think it was actually ever, it shouldn't be read as an actual proposal. It's read as a provocation to try to like tweak the nose of as many people as he could and offend the sensibilities of as many people as he could, because in actuality, I think you can read him as saying, what we need is state-mandated eugenics. Since we're in this lily-livered democracy, we're never gonna get that. So I guess it has to be voluntary with the asterisk, like, but we know that will never happen, right? So it's also a sense of like the futility of actually improving these outcomes where people are so uptight about having their autonomy of their own reproduction.
I'm Eric. I'm a history PhD student here. I was really struck by the juxtaposition of the Aryan map and then the items from Mendes Cohen, and your mention of how it's anti-Semitism. The Cohen family was instrumental in achieving the legal equality of Jews in Maryland, and I mean they owned enslaved people, so I can see them being on board with the anti-Black racism, but certainly not on board with the anti-Semitism. And I'm just curious about the place of the racial status of Jews and also the relationship with the Baltimore Jewish community in your story about Johns Hopkins.
I mean, this is where all of these questions spin out into all of these other subfields. So I don't know if I can at all speak to what is happening in relationship to the Baltimore Jewish community. But what I will say is, I think this is the real value of looking in detail at all of these kind of micro moments, because there are so many contradictions that don't make sense. I think going into this project, I thought, well, there's going to be, you know, clear evidence of aha racist moments and people who participate and people who don't, and it's just a big mess. And you see people taking advantage of racism against other groups to elevate themselves in ways that clearly made sense to them in the moment, but from my perspective seem really self-defeating, you know, in the long view. We see this even in other issues that are raised in that same seminar room. So in that image that had Herbert Baxter Adams at the head of the table, there's a Japanese graduate student who's sitting there, and we know that, you know, we have all these, this documentation of seminar sessions that happen in that room, and, you know, in one instance, that particular graduate student and another Japanese graduate student gave a paper about how Japanese people were clearly that much more intelligent and had more history than Chinese people. So you see there are all of these different ways in which people are modulating their, I don't know what you call it. I mean, racism is too broad a term, these very complicated relationships that are being worked out within that space. And what I was really trying to get at in you know, a little kind of glimpse of this work is, this is an environment, a built and staged environment that actually insists on these kinds of behaviors, and it's hard to resist. We have little glimpses of resistance, but it's really hard to get a hold of, and often those are not documented in the ways that we want. So my short answer is, it's really messy and quite surprising, and I think that's the value of doing this really, you know, long-term deep research, because it exposes all of the contradictions.
I mean, wouldn't it also be true that typologies of race are just not stable over time? Like, so in the 1890s, to talk about Aryan migration, you know, that didn't have the associations with the anti-Semitism of the Nazis that obviously would have, 4 decades later, would have been a much more neutral, objective kind of.
The other story that we're missing here is this particular room is sort of tangential to the Sanskrit seminary, where they're talking about Aryans in a completely different way. So it's really complicated.
Further questions?
Thank you. My question's for Dr. Connolly. You sort of glossed over the changes between 2016 and now in like a sentence, and I was wondering if you could add a little bit more detail into what that process has been like, the ways it's been difficult, and also really talk more about how you think it happened.
I was on a search committee for the new Dean of Arts and Sciences. We had an interim dean at the time, a scientist, a woman named Beverly Wendland, who's gone on to do provost work at WashU. And I had a meeting where, you know, she was going to throw her hat in the ring for the deanship, and I was also debating whether or not to serve on this committee. And this would have been in 2014, 15. And Dr. Wendland had all kinds of designs and plans for building new science buildings, and it was, you know, it was very clear, like, you know, hard sciences, lab sciences, you know, capital campaigns, so on and so forth. And at the time that we had this meeting, we were basically, you know, we had been hemorrhaging Black faculty. So we had lost Michael Hanchard already to the University of Pennsylvania. We had lost Sipa Grovigi, also in political science. And the numbers were already small from the outset, so we hadn't gotten to that point in 2014, 15, that we were down to 3 black faculty in the entire college, of 300. You can do the percentages. So in the context, and you know, one of the things that people just didn't notice, they hadn't been counted. When I was on the committee to serve, I had the opportunity to ask a version of a question steeped in those facts to all the candidates who were coming through for this, you know, high-profile position. Each of them was horrified because it ran contrary to how the headhunting firm had been advertising Hopkins as basically being 25% minority faculty. They've been counting all the Asian nationals in the quantitative fields and so on and so forth, but the numbers were what they were. And of course, being in that room on a committee that's as glittery as like the Dean Search Committee, you wind up sitting in this kind of proximity to members of the board of trustees and, you know, other kinds of muckety-mucks, you know, distinguished professors and so forth. And I remember around my 3rd or 4th time framing this question to candidates, a man by the name of Roger Faxon, who was a former CEO of EMI Music and a longtime member of the board of trustees, kind of leans into me and he's like, I had no idea the numbers were that bad, right? The conversation for that year began to be one where the narrative around the crisis of faculty of color had started to change. I mean, it's incredible, again, thinking structurally, universities are built to protect the board of trustees from really having any communication with anybody else down on the food chain, except for maybe undergrads who are really great potential donating alumni, right? But those of us who are in the trenches actually doing the management of the institution, this goes back to, you know, letters you can find written by Isaiah Bowman, right? That the way you govern a place like this is by making sure that the pieces remain segmented. But there was a moment of real bleeding across these fissures. And so I want to be very clear, like, this isn't about like, you know, a single person, me, you know, kind of starting some movement, but it was simply about breaching a divide that then made it impossible for people to, again, unsee the problem, right? So immediately upon that conversation kind of beginning to pick up speed, and there were other people who were making similar kinds of points. Mark Christian Thompson, the English department, was there. You know, a number of others. There were some undergraduates and graduate students who were pressing this issue. And it was impossible to put that genie back in the bottle. All of a sudden, diversity and kind of faculty composition reports became a really important thing. And that same year, by the time I wound up leaving for NYU, because it was just a really great fit, 3 basic faculty went down to 2, right? So the only 2 black faculty members were Mark Christian Thompson, Katrina Bell McDonald, and Lester Spence in political science after I had gone. And so that created some crises. So immediately then, the dean started approving all kinds of, you know, targets of opportunity searches. So even in that first year, we hired Larry Jackson, we hired Jessica Marie Johnson. The following year, I came back and had negotiated an additional line that wound up creating Martha Jones. By that point, Martha Jones became, to be clear, the first black woman full professor ever hired in the humanities. Jessica Marie Johnson became the first black assistant professor ever hired by the Department of History. Larry Jackson became the first black full professor among the Americanists, who was a man. And, you know, that same year I became the first, actually that same year I was actually the first black tenure professor because I was in-house and Larry was still being appointed. But all that to say, each of us became a black first of one kind or another. And so that emergency among the administration combined with the sense of momentum in the department to basically mean that we were not having searches anymore, that we didn't talk about race and racism as constituting the faculty. I want to make very briefly one point of contrast. When I was first hired, my very first year in the department, this is back in the day when they didn't have Interfolio, and you had to submit hard copies, and there were stacks of files on the floor, and about waist high, 4 of them, 4 stacks. And I remember, as you know, the ink was barely dry in my dissertation. I was like, how did I make it out of this pool, right? And I realized very quickly that, you know, you're not ever really in the pool, right? The way the search politics tend to work is like, you know, people are already identified at the very beginning of the search process to basically be selected. But during that year, I was brought in as a quote-unquote AFAM person, and the following year, they're now going to run a U.S. history search, because now they need an Americanist, which is what I actually studied, right? And it was clear, you know, because you had the files, hard copy in the department, you have to physically go to the history department and sit down on a couch there and read files alongside your colleagues. You couldn't take the files out. So I would move files, you know, I was asked to move files from the long list to the short list, and I was talking to people on the conference circuit, apply. And I would always go back and see really amazing scholars of color whose dossiers I had recommended to be advanced move back to the discard pile. And these are you know, luminaries in the field now. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Donna Merge, Devarian Baldwin, you know, I mean, yeah, Leah Wright McGurk, who was now on the faculty, you know, the list goes on and on and on. And I finally had a chance to sit down alongside a senior member of the search committee who was very open with me about what he was doing. He was basically like, at first he started with an anecdote about a junior colleague who had been denied tenure at his hand, kind of like a little like salt on the meal. And then he proceeded to tell me, he's like, yeah, you know, I'm bracketing out anybody who does race, because you're the race guy, right? And he kind of said it with a smile on his face. And there's a longer story about me having to recount the story to my wife and how outraged she was, and the comment had actually washed over me, because it seemed so glib and like casual that I didn't really realize until having to retell the story how bad it really was. But it was one of those things where we were not, and there came a point where I had to make a stink with a number of very important comrades in a meeting that, you know, I was not in fact the race guy, and that race is not a topic, it's a category of analysis, and that's why I started teaching racial literacy in the archives. And pretty quickly, once we got a critical mass of people, the dominoes just started moving, right? And before you knew what it was like, we had to hire, you know, a young Caribbeanist, Sasha Turner, who was here for the day. We had to hire, you know, a new Africanist who became Didier Gondola. We ended up having to hire somebody who was an Africana Studies line, because that was the other thing. And this speaks to the mechanics. The dean's office saw the problem, and I also had blown a whistle with the external reviewers, like, yeah, there's a lot of racism here. But the deans had decided to seize lines and give them to Africana Studies. So Africana Studies was running searches and then bringing these lines back as vouchers to the history department. So the history department had to basically, they wound up hiring people that included Jessica Marie Johnson and Minka Makalani, ultimately. So all this to say that it's a good strategy to think about centers and programs and how, in building their capacity, particularly in places like Hopkins that have very conservative tenure structures, you have to be able to appoint them in conservative mainline departments, even as they're servicing centers and programs. So that winds up meaning that we end up getting so many historians who were affiliated with other centers and programs, but their tenure home was in the history department, to the point where there's now a bloat in 20th century, I would argue. But it was one of those things where the combination of having contact with trustees, having deans or leadership that were very committed to this because they knew it was a point of embarrassment, having centers and programs that were as vessels for doing the hiring, and again, having, you know, colleagues who were willing to acknowledge that the history of the department itself needed to be addressed through hiring first and foremost. That cocktail of factors really contributed to it.
And maybe there's just one other factor, which is 2015, the uprising happens in Baltimore City, and there's a Black student movement on campus that re-energizes.
Yes, but I don't, but see the only problem I have with that as a causal point is the administration was very good at that point in like tamping down the demands, right, of that. Because there should have been a Department of Africana Studies in 2015 or 2016 if that was the case. But we have a very nimble leadership in terms of how to deal with student dissent.
Yeah, they respond with reports. I think we have time for one more question, yeah.
Hi, my name is Rhonda Robinson. I'm a School of Engineering alum. Was anyone from the Whiting School approached to be a part of this project?
No. I mean, we had a general call for papers.
Yep.
And we didn't have anybody from engineering. We had one colleague, Professor Gray, I'm looking at my man's name right now, his first name. He's really active in the diversity and inclusion sector of the university, but his proposals were around undergraduate education. They weren't about research projects from scholars inside the engineering school. So we didn't get any proposals from them.
I think we could probably take another.
Last weekend, I stood up at the Henrietta Lacks Monument Memorial and spoke, and I was nerve-wracked. But the guy who spoke before me, the man who spoke before me, who's a lawyer who works at Meharry, talked about the courage required to do this work. And first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge the courage that it takes to do the work that you've done from inside the university. But my question, I guess, is that the thing that struck me about I'm blanking on his last name, Daniel.
Dawes.
Thank you, Dr. Dawes. Thank you. The thing that struck me about Dawes's comments at the end of his talk was that right before I got up to speak, I felt like he had opened an umbrella that I could stand under when I talked. It gave me a sense of courage about what I had to do next. And I'm struck, Nathan, by the reasons that you joined the faculty at Hopkins the first time, and how they, in some ways, mirror my own reasons for joining the Hopkins faculty. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we make sure we open the umbrella and make sure that there are other people who come and stand under it with us as we continue this work, even if we don't have the power to affect hiring 8 people and change the literal face of a department.
That's a more complicated question than you know. Because, it's one thing to kind of be, a pilgrim in the wilderness, right? It's another thing entirely to build collectivities and to, and this is really important, to recognize your limits in what you're trained in versus what is necessary, right? So one of the things that is so clear about talking to people who have come through these extraordinarily difficult experiences, and you can see it when you interview people or when you meet people who've had experiences as these lone folk, that they're carrying a lot of things that you cannot address at the seminar table. There's no methodology class that you can do or pull together that can do all the things that need to be done to help people feel like there's a home and that they're actually shielded, to use your umbrella analogy, right? So really, it's becoming clear only now, I would say, based on having now a critical mass of Black faculty, a critical mass of graduate students, that there are other kinds of expertise that we need to genuinely create a positive and functional and, appropriately service community. And it means, in some ways, just realizing that in spite of all the ways that we're meant to kind of be masters of the universe, there's just some things we don't know. There's some skills that we just don't have. And y'all are really much better at that, I think, in your fields, because you're like, I loved your answers. I'm not a urologist. I'm not going to talk to that question, and yet, right? We tend not to have those scruples in my field. Oh yeah, I'll philosophize and do sociology and whatever, and do psychology. But it really is important. It really is important. And the more I enter formally created therapeutic spaces, which has been a lot for reasons that have to do with my own personal, life and where I'm at right now, I realize that you need people with those kinds of skill sets formally to really make the umbrellas real in a lot of places. Like there's a real limit to what you can do in simple intellectual terms. One last thing on the courage front. I mean, I appreciate that for this reason, among many that I won't say, which is that there is an assumption that when you have tenure, because we are part of the 1% in the world of work, that we are able to then just kind of be advocates and reckless and do and say whatever whenever, and oftentimes too that we then should be responsible for carrying the weight of making the institution more moral, right? That's been one of the hardest things about being a part of witnessing in OIE investigations or trying to help graduate students or junior faculty or staff people navigate these processes, having contingent faculty with whom I have very intimate relationships, experience discrimination, and having to figure out a way to make space for them. There are so many ways in which, again, I really want to come back to this imagery, but I think it's appropriate. Holding that umbrella is exhausting, and it has holes in it. And umbrellas don't really do things against asteroids, right? There's a lot of ways in which it has a lot of limitations to it. And I think there are ways in which, and this actually is a somewhat clumsy connection, but Talia, I was really taken with your point about kind of should Ray Key get an apology? Should Israel get an apology? there have been so many moments where folks close to me, and myself included, have just wanted like an acknowledgement that something happened, right? Like these places are not built to acknowledge that there are crimes, like not microaggressions, not like, you know, daily indignities, but literal violations of the law that are happening against members of this community. And the only thing that gives me pause is actually, and it makes me a little bit more cynical than I probably should be, is an article by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot called Abortive Rituals, where he talks about the uses of apologies to actually reify the injustices inside of institutions. So this, I feel this speaks to some of Danny's concerns earlier about like the Vivian Thomas iconography. Is like that thing can oftentimes be a really powerful fig leaf for then not raising anything else, you know, at the institution. And so again, that umbrella image, now I have like Wile E. Coyote in my mind with the umbrella, right? Which never worked. But it feels a lot like that because, you know, there's no other source of protection oftentimes, even for those of us who structurally have a fair amount of power, you know.
Okay.
Can I just say something?
Yeah, sorry. I got the room, it's all right.
To that question of yours, I mean, I think how I've been thinking about it is the usefulness of the outsider perspective. Even though most of the time it feels like, oh my goodness, I must be off base if I'm noticing these things. But there is a real utility to that sense of wonder is too kind of word, just the strangeness of some of the things we encounter. And I found a real sense of a sense of solidarity with other people who say, no, that is strange, because once we get into our own disciplines, the kind of traditional ways in which those disciplines reproduce themselves seem completely normalized to us, but are really quite odd, right? So having that ability to reapproach things as an outsider has its real uses. I think for me, it's also really important to figure out ways to analyze the kind of built environments and the kind of scholarly environments that also reproduce these forms of harm, so that you can go, as I did in the first part of my talk, basically from one part of the room to the next and read it differently, as opposed to just be overwhelmed by what seems very discomforting or discomfiting, right? So learning to be able to read things and then try to explain that to other people is a way to, again, be aware that you're not imagining these things. They are real and they have real effects on people, and they make people do things that, you know, we don't want to participate in sometimes. But more than anything, I think it's just being able to talk to a lot of people quite openly. I think one really important part of this project for me has been able to talk with graduate students and undergraduates, and particularly people who have finished their graduate study and have returned as, you know, fully minted PhDs who wanted to participate in this project, and having it be a way to have difficult conversations about disciplinary practices that are not being addressed within those intellectual spheres. So I think in general it is sometimes quite terrifying, but it also has generated a lot of really positive things.
I was going to say, any other hands? Okay, thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers. We'll be in touch about the next steps.
Yeah.